All right. Erin Richards, come on up. National Education Reporter for USA Today will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Karen. I'm honored and delighted today to be introducing my close friend, Mary Louise Schumacher, an independent journalist, filmmaker, and art critic. I met Mary Louise about 15 years ago when I was a cub reporter in Waukesha. I was brand new to the city and to my first job in a big city newspaper. And I was reporting on suburban government, and some of the council meetings I was in were so boring that I was looking for something else to write about. And I thought, maybe there's got to be something going on in the art scene here. So I dug into some local messaging boards, and I was like, kind of trying to figure out my way. And the first response I got back was from Mary Louise Schumacher at the downtown bureau. And she's like, are you looking for stories? And it's a big thing, like, don't tromp on other people's beats. And she's like, no, I could use the help. There's too much going on here for me to write about, so please help out. That spirit of collaboration and generosity, especially extended to those of us who have a deep appreciation for the arts, but we're not actually trained in it, is central to knowing and understanding Mary Louise. She was the art and architecture critic for the Journal Sentinel for 18 years, and in 2019, her position was eliminated in a system-wide downsizing by Gannett. After she left the JS, she co-created the This Is Milwaukee project with artist and photographer Kevin Miyazaki. The publication and multimedia project explored the personal views on democracy held by about 100 people in our community, old to rich, young to old, rich to poor, white to non-white across our community. In 2007, Mary Louise was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and in 2019, she was the Clarice Smith Distinguished Critic at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I trip over that title every single time. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Art News, Nieman Reports, Milwaukee Magazine, and Wisconsin People and Ideas. She was born and raised in Santa Barbara, California, and she worked on the East Coast before coming here to write about the development of the art and architecture of the Calatrava. She lives on the east side with her longtime partner, Ken, as well as Edna, a terrier they adopted during the pandemic. And currently, Mary Louise is working on the first feature-length documentary about art critics in America and what the rise and fall of that profession means for understanding the world of art and what it may mean for what you and I get to experience. The film, called Out of the Picture, is due out later this year. Mary Louise?
Okay, get my glasses. Right, 2 seconds. All right. Hello, everybody. How are you today? Thank you so much for having me here. Erin, I love you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Megan, thank you for that truly inspired invocation. I'm super excited to hear Millie and Sam. That was like so inspiring to see you invited into this organization. And to Rotary, I do want to say thank you for the work that you do. You're an inspiration, and it's really a privilege to be in this room with you. And I do want to just acknowledge really briefly the essential behind-the-scenes support that Rotary provided to the This Is Milwaukee project that Erin mentioned. There are copies of it on your table. That was my collaboration with Kevin Miyazaki. You really did provide essential advice. It made a difference, and we were very grateful for that. So I am here today to tell you the story of a remarkable little museum. As an art critic, I have traveled all over the world to look at art. And I can tell you that the Art Preserve in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just less than an hour's drive from where we sit today, is one of the most remarkable museums in the world. It's the first museum in the country, and maybe even the world, focused wholly on works of artists known as environment builders. Now, these are artists whose beliefs and worldviews take immersive forms. These are artists who turn rooms, entire homes, and properties into works of art. While most museums are concerned with collecting individual objects, say paintings or sculptures, The Art Preserve wants it all. They believe that in certain circumstances, all of the material gathered around the life of an artist is worth collecting. They believe that these environments are, in fact, the artworks themselves. For the Art Preserve, this could mean literally gathering thousands upon thousands of objects for a single artist, including really fragile things like letters and journals and work tools. Until very recently, many of these artists did not have a natural place to sit within the larger art world. They were regarded as different and other and set off into separate rooms, away from the main galleries and separate from the established taxonomies of art history. They got lumped into categories that just didn't quite fit or tell the whole story. Categories like outsider art, folk art, self-taught art. One of the reasons these artists were not well understood was the sheer challenge of simply identifying, preserving, and collecting this kind of work. And this is where the John Michael Kohler Art Center comes in. The Art Center, also in Sheboygan, in cooperation with the Kohler Foundation, a nonprofit known for rescuing art sites, has pioneered much of the thinking and scholarship around the work of environment builders. Together, they have acquired and preserved more than 30 of these artist environments over a period of nearly 40 years. And it is that incredible legacy and that incredible collection which is the basis for the Art Preserve, which opened last summer. Indeed, the Art Preserve is an odd hybrid institution. It is really three things in one. First and foremost, it's a very unconventional storage facility. The light is low, objects are sometimes placed right on the floor or high up onto shelves that you cannot see. There's almost nothing to read. Didactics or museum labels, such as they are very rare and more about a gentle prompt or question than any kind of deep explanation. Second, it is an experimental museum. It's a big storage closet that is also open to the public to come and explore. And third, it's a study center where scholars are expected to come from all over the world to explore this kind of work. Fronted by a screen of timbers, the museum is nestled near the Sheboygan River and made from some of the same materials that inspired the artists inside: wood, river rock, and concrete. The architect, Michael Moore of Trey Birds in Denver, has described his building as hunkered down like a fox in the hillside. Kind of love that. So let's take a look at some of the artists inside and what you'll see. Dr. Charles Smith, Dr. Charles Smith is one of only 2 artists in the collection who's actually known to be alive today. He preaches and educates with his sculptures, hundreds of hip-height figures that he reworks, repaints, and rearranges constantly around his home in Louisiana. It's a site he calls the African American Heritage Museum and Black Veterans Archive. Dr. Smith believes that people need that physical and visual experience in order to internalize hard truths, particularly the history of racial violence in the United States. During his free-form sermon-like tours, Dr. Smith connects that past with the news of the day, and also his own life story, including the racially motivated murder of his father when he was just 14 years old, and his combat experiences in Vietnam. In an interview with Dr. Smith, he told me, long before Black Lives Matter, Dr. Smith's art was telling what's the matter. Last fall, Dr. Smith visited the preserve and rearranged 200 of the sculptures held in that collection, once again recrafting the narrative he's telling, keeping that history alive It's hoped that he'll continue to visit and do this for the rest of his life. Here's something else Dr. Smith said in our interview, which I really love. Without a museum, as a culture and a people, you're like a piece of paper rolling down the street without any destination. A museum teaches you who you are. In many ways, the work of Eugene Von Bruenchenhein, another artist, is at the core of the Art Preserve's collection. Ruth Kohler, the late, longtime visionary director of the John Michael Kohler Art Center, discovered his work in 1983. She visited his tiny West Allis home based on a tip from a police officer, not long after the artist had died. The place was absolutely overrun with art. EVB, as he is now known, created liquidy apocalyptic paintings, clay crowns and incense pots, and spindly sculptures constructed from chicken bones. He used materials he could get his hands on for free, like clay that he dug up near State Fair Park, paintbrushes made with his wife's hair, salvaged car paints, and the bones famously left over from his chicken dinners. Ruth and her people wanted to protect everything they possibly could within this little house, and there were no best practices for how to do this at the time. They created these special little slings and put them in the back of the moving trucks to get these fragile chicken bone sculptures up the I-43 to Sheboygan. At the Preserve, EBV's work is organized in a house-like tableau that evokes the feeling that Ruth and her colleagues had crossing the threshold of that little house. Personally, I love the glow and clicking sound of a slide projector that entice visitors towards a small, cubby-sized room near the back of the house, where the intimate portraits of EVB's wife, Marie, as both muse and radiant queen, are projected. If EVB is at the core of the collection, it is Emery Blagdon's healing machine that is perhaps its masterpiece. On his Nebraska farm, Emery Blagdon tinkered with what he called his healing machine for more than 30 years. The little shack was festooned with intricate, radiating constructions made of things like baling wire, minerals, TV parts, small paintings, and countless other oddments. Blagdon believed that the energies of the earth could be drawn up through the dirt floor and into this tiny space to bounce around and to heal. He believed that objects of aesthetic power could in fact restore the human body. Few people knew about Blagdon or his healing machine when he was alive. After he died, a friend acquired the little shack at auction and spent 18 years looking for someone to save it. It has rarely been seen or exhibited. Today, it is a crowning jewel at the Art Preserve, one of the most intact environments in their collection. There are other artists at the Preserve who will undoubtedly upend people's misconceptions. Some will come to the Preserve assuming that these artists are from well outside the art world, that maybe they're from rural places, or that they are reclusive or untrained. Again, this goes back to some of those imperfect categories like outsider and folk. But let's take a look at an artist like Lenore Tawney. She was an urbanite and part of the mainstream art world, living for a time on New York's famous Coenty Slip, alongside other artists like Agnes Martin and Ellsworth Kelly. But Lenore also collapsed the distance between her life and her art-infused surroundings, so this made her a perfect fit for the Preserve. Her loft studio is faithfully reimagined at the Preserve, including a floor that's painted white, something she always did with her studios, and glass shelves where smooth stones, shells, pottery, and wooden forms are carefully aligned. Her space and her objects were an inspiration for her gauzy, dimensional textile works, which also hang in this space, beside her couch and her spools of thread. Some of her works are rigorously woven like little manifestos on what weaving should be, while others are slack and expressively open, at times intimating the female form. Or let's look at the work of Ray Yoshida, an esteemed art teacher very connected to the art world, who created an unexpected museum in his apartment. He jammed shelves and wall spaces with really important works of art alongside whirligigs and pencils and pop culture paraphernalia and personal to-do lists, you name it. Yoshida shuffled and reshuffled his kaleidoscopic collection masterfully, like a material in its own right. That kind of constant rejiggering and fresh juxtapositions that he made, not unlike the way Dr. Smith moves the figures around his yard in Louisiana, was like a performance and a constantly evolving work of art. At the Preserve, the painting Yoshida was working on when he died is on view, but it's the tight groupings of his stuff and the high-low mashup of these things that is perhaps most artful. What I've described so far is just 5 of the 38 artists who are at the Preserve, a number that will certainly grow over time. But let me sort of quickly run you through a few more. When you walk through the doors of the Art Preserve, a functioning bar will greet you. And yes, you can sidle up and talk about art over an actual beer. This honors Fred Smith, one of the very first artists to come into this collection. And it honors his Northwoods Tavern, which today is still surrounded by gigantic concrete sculptures inlaid with glass from broken beer bottles. You'll also discover this glitter-encrusted home, one of the great conservation challenges for the Preserve. It was the work of Loy Bowlin, who, inspired by the Glen Campbell hit, called himself the original rhinestone cowboy. And many of you in this room will certainly know the name of Mary Nohl. Her home beside Lake Michigan is a legendary drive-by that some locals call the Witch's House. The Arts Center spent more than 30 years trying to rescue her reputation as an artist and her cottage, which remains intact, I'm happy to report, in Fox Point. But part of the facade of her home has been moved to the Preserve, along with her ceramics, paintings, jewelry, and a wall of her work tools. Also on view is the largest repository of Nek Chand figures outside of India, the wooden menagerie of Levi Fischer Ames, Albert Zahn's carved birds and angels, and the resin library Stella Waitzkin created in her Chelsea hotel room in New York. It's important to stop and point out that there is an irony in this story. The Kohler embraced the work of visionary artists who, on the one hand, have gone under-recognized, but also, and especially in the early years, were mostly white men. In this sense, that focus, though not the entire program of the Kohler, shares some problematic similarities with the rest of the museum world, a world that is rightly going through a reckoning around issues of race, representation, and colonialism. There are some unique reasons this imbalance exists for environment builders in particular, the curators will tell us, including the fact that women and artists of color have historically been less likely to own the kinds of properties that can be transformed into art in this way. Still, an art historical reconsideration is certainly called for. There is something else amiss at the Preserve, too. There is a huge loss whenever an art environment is relocated. The original sites are deeply connected to their meaning. But the practical nature of property rights and issues of long-term care make preserving them in place unworkable at times. And so, moving them becomes the better choice than losing them altogether. To some extent, though, you will feel this sense of loss at the preserve. And the absence of the artist who so deeply inhabited their environments is poignantly felt too. Fred Smith can't pour you a lager, and Stella Waitzkin's library is not animated by the cast of writers and painters from her hotel room. But I want to tell you what another artist had to say about all of this. I started my talk today talking with you about Dr. Charles Smith, one of the two artists in the preserve who's known to be living. Let me now begin to wrap up with the words of the other artist, Gregory Van Maanen. Like Dr. Smith, Van Maanen was also a Vietnam veteran, and I am thoughtful about where we sit today, this profound memorial to those who've served. Van Maanen makes art 7 days a week for several hours a day as what he calls a form of deliverance, a Zen practice to keep the horrifying memories of war at bay. For decades, the art world rejected him and his work, raucous paintings of skulls, glowing orbs, and floating eyeballs. When I asked Gregory what it meant to have his work installed at the preserve, and what he felt about the absence of so many artists within it, this is what he had to say. I'll tell you though, you get a concentration of work like that, and their spirit is there. I've seen the spirit go from the work and into the people. It's not art, it's medicine. What I hope has become clear today is that the Art Preserve in Sheboygan is important not only for its uniqueness, but also for the questions it provokes about what art is and who we get to call an artist today. One of the things I admire so much about the Kohler and the Preserve is how they hold expertise and a healthy appreciation for what they don't yet know in a kind of creative tension. They allow the language and a fuller understanding of these artists to develop over time and around the work itself. This is really how more museums should work, as laboratories for the biggest open-ended questions there are. Too often, the opposite order of events are at play in our art institutions, which instead emphasize their roles as the keepers of the canon. As a journalist and a reporter, I've done my best to faithfully report something of what the Art Preserve is for you today. Though I can say the story is far richer than I can convey in the time that I have. And the real experts are those who have pioneered this work, especially Ruth Kohler, who envisioned the preserve more than 15 years ago and died shortly before it opened. Leslie Umberger, the visionary curator who is now at the Smithsonian. Amy Horst, the director of the Kohler. Laura Bickford, curator at the Preserve. Karen Patterson, who is now in Philadelphia. And art historians Lisa Stone and Deborah Bramer. If you have not yet been, I hope you will consider a trip to Sheboygan to see both the Preserve and the Kohler Art Center, which has a great program of contemporary art. And I hope you will appreciate how rare it is to be in a place where there are so few curatorial guideposts, where no one is telling you what to think about the art. As I mentioned, it's a pretty easy drive. At present, they are inviting visitors to register in advance on their website due to COVID. If you're interested in going deeper into this subject, I've written about the Preserve and the Kohler's legacy several times in the last year or so for the New York Times, Milwaukee Magazine, and Wisconsin People and Ideas. And I would also recommend these books for further reading. I'm also happy to share my own bibliography on the subject and would welcome being in touch with any of you for any reason for that matter. So please do not hesitate to reach out. And with that, I thank you and I invite your questions. Back there. Yes, so the question, and I'm going to repeat all the questions, I will not forget, is what is the definition of outsider art? And, you know, it's a really great question, and there are all this kind of constellation of terms: outsider art, art brut, folk art, self-taught art, and they're all really imperfect. And I remember literally 20 years ago writing about this museum early on the phone with Leslie Umberger, and she kind of schooled me on what was wrong with every single one of those labels. Outsider, outside of what? You know, the art world is not one thing. It's a what it has historically meant are people who tend to be working outside of the mainstream art world. They may not have gallery representation. They may not have been academically trained. But, you know, to some extent, every artist is self-taught on some level. And the boundaries of what the art world are just not considered as formal and constrained as they were even 10 years ago. I mean, we have art flowing through our devices every day. So what is outside today? It's really a term that should be kind of, I think, retired, if that makes sense. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes. Sure. So the question is, if I understand it correctly, what is the relationship, I'm going to presume, between the Kohler Art Center and the preserve and local school children? And I think the comment is really a good one, that it feels like a place where kids should be allowed to just like run around and be inspired by this, because it's kind of a no rules sort of place in a way, at least philosophically, right? And I'm not from the institution myself. What I can tell you is that the Kohler is sort of famous for bringing all of its school children through. So the kids in Kohler and Sheboygan, all of them go to the Kohler Art Center. You walk in the door and immediately you see spaces that are occupied by children, school children. So that is very front and center for them. And one thing I've noticed about Sheboygan over the years is I will interview people who will have this sort of comfort level with art and talking about art because they have had that experience from when they were young all the way through their lives because of the Kohler. I think the Kohler really has given that whole community a very kind of open-ended, lovely, comfortable relationship with culture, and school children are very much front and center in all of that. Yes, sir.
We were little kids who'd been on a beach boats.
Yes.
Real test of bravery was on Halloween.
Yes. Yes.
I didn't quite know what the definition of this, but it was the status now.
Yes. That's a great question. So the question is, this gentleman said he visited the witch's house, Mary Nohl's home, in Fox Point, and especially on Halloween, which is something that teenagers find it very spooky in the moonlight, right? Like that's the deal. And the question is, what is the current status of the Mary Nohl home? What I can tell you is several years ago, Ruth Kohler, when she was still alive, and the Kohler Art Center had plans to have the home physically removed from its site in Fox Point and brought to what is now the preserve. The preserve is on 38 acres of former farmland, and they were literally going to bring the whole house up there. And certain people, myself included, really protested that idea because Mary Nohl was an artist who was responding to Lake Michigan. Her materials were coming out of the lake and across the beach. She used driftwood and stone. And if you took that away from that site, you would lose so much of its meaning. The problem, of course, is that the folks in Fox Point are not super into art visitors on their street. And there's been a very contentious back and forth about this in that town. So right now, most of us can't really go and see the Mary Nohl house, but it is now in the Kohler Center owns it. They care for it. There is a curator living there full time. Scholarship is ongoing there, and there's kind of a collaboration back. And so if you go to the preserve, you will see this giant filing cabinet with a lot of her flat file works, her paintings and drawings. A ton of her work is there, and part of the facade of the house is there. So it's kind of in both places, if that makes sense. So scholars can kind of go back and forth between the two. Great question. Yes. Von Bruenchenhein. Yeah. EVB, it's easier. Yeah.
What led the curator?
And do you mean EVB or do you mean Gregory Van Maanen, the guy that the chicken bone guy? Oh, the eyeballs. I love how we figured this out. Yeah, no. So the question is, how did the Kohler make a decision to value the work of Gregory Van Maanen when the whole of the art world had disregarded him? It's a great question, and I have to say, I think it really did come from individuals like Ruth and Leslie Umberger equally as much. Their instinct, like they had their own instinct, and Ruth, as a young person in Wisconsin, had seen Fred Smith's tavern. She experienced a lot of the environments in Wisconsin of which we have more than most states, we think. Like there's just a lot of this kind of material here. And so she had a kind of interest in that kind of work early on that developed at the Kohler. And then curators like Leslie Umberger, who's just brilliant about this, she had her own point of view. You know, she was not, the art world was zigging and they were zagging. I mean, I don't know how else to put it other than that. And today, so, you know, they also collected EVB, Eugene Von Bruenchenhein, who has since, you know, they were alone in valuing his work. And he has since become like an art world darling. He was written up in the New York Times. He's been shown in New York galleries. He's been at the oldest show of avant-garde on earth, the Venice Biennale. Like he is very, very well known and collected in the art world today. And the same is true now with Gregory Van Maanen, who is like working in total obscurity, but now he's got gallery representation and his work is not cheap to acquire. so they, I think the Kohler, and I will say this too, when I first started my job at the Journal Sentinel, if I talked to sources in New York or some other city, they would often say, oh, you're so lucky. You're in that state where the Kohler is. Like the Kohler absolutely does have an international reputation for this kind of work. And so I think when they acknowledge an artist and go deep with that artist, the rest of the art world does, you know, pay attention. Great question, Barbara. Megan.
I just wanted to say that having been to the preserve, if I had friends coming out of town, I would absolutely take them there. Fascinating. It's hard to tell from a TV representation how cool it is.
Yeah.
But it's full.
Yeah.
What are the plans in the future?
Yeah.
Expansion or, you know, you say they have to do with additional collecting that will.
Yes. So Megan's question and her comment initially was, you know, if she had people coming in from out of town, it is a place she would automatically think of to take her art-interested friends. And her impression is that it feels extremely full. And so what happens in the future when the Kohler continues to do its work in collecting and acquires more environments? I asked that question myself, and they, you know, they say there's still a lot of room. It doesn't feel like that, but there are, like if you go up to the very top floor, there are only 3 artists on that top floor. And there's quite a bit of open space on the second floor. And it is technically a storage closet. So, the closet might get a little more cluttered over time, and we might have a little bit more of an adventure, kind of wending our way around things. But they believe that they will be able to continue to collect at the pace at which they do for like another 20 or 25 years, something like that, with this building. The other question I will say, and the question Megan had also was, what is the plans for the property, the 38 acres? Originally, the plan was that some of these environments would be transported and placed outside. And, that is a lot of land, and there is the possibility for certain works of art that can live outside to be stored in that way. But what they have told me is that really most of this work should be inside the building for its long-term care and conservation. Oh, sorry, Mary, go for it. Yes. Yes, I can. So people have asked, the question is, what is the film that I'm working on? So thank you for that. I am working on a documentary film about art critics. I started making this film about 10 years ago when I was still a working critic at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and I noticed that my colleagues across the country were losing their jobs. And I really wondered what it would mean for cities like Milwaukee to be without this person whose job it is to just bear witness to what artists in a community do. And so I turned my cameras on about 5 or 6 critics, and I've been following them for 10 years. And so what's happened, and what's really interesting about this, is that it happened to be a 10-year period of really dramatic, historic change for both media and art. I mean, nothing is the same as it was at that time. The smartphone camera was not invented when we started rolling. Art, as I said a minute ago, is now, the tools of the artist that were once rare are now in everybody's hands. And so visual culture is flowing everywhere. And the job of determining what's artful, what's worthy of our attention, feels as important as ever. And so what our film has really done is watch these people live through this incredible period of change. And what I hope is that you'll come away from watching this film thinking about, how our relationship to media has changed, how our relationship to culture has changed, and who we should and should not be paying attention to a little bit too. So yes, thank you for that question, Mary. One more time. When can you watch the film? It will be completed this year. We just last year completed production in 10 cities over 27 days, and we are now hip deep in the editing process. We'll be done by summer, and then we'll begin applying for festivals, and then it will go out into the world after that. Thank you for asking. Yes, I think one more question. Okay. Sorry, I see one.
I'm interested in the business side, the economic side of the equation, the video side, knowing but maybe talk a little bit about the business side. People have all this wonderful art. How to go somewhere.
Okay, I think the question is, what's the Kohler factor in all of this? I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but it's a really good question. So when I was working on my reporting for some stories I've written about the preserve, I asked the question, who is paying for this? The project was about a $40 million project, which by museum standards is actually fairly modest. But they didn't really want to tell me the answer to that. And it's usually I can go to certain forums that you can find and find the answer to that through documents. And I couldn't find the documents either. And so there's kind of a labyrinthian layering of organizations and trusts that are associated with the Kohler family. And when I went to the preserve, somebody who works there just said, go look at the wall over there. And what I saw on the wall of donors was an enormous number of organizations. Some I was familiar with, others I were not, but many of them bearing the Kohler name. So the Kohler family, which runs the Kohler factory, famous for the luxurious sinks and toilets, is basically a very big factor in philanthropy in these two institutions. I hope that answers your question. Yes, sir. We've got about 2 minutes left.
Last slide you had here, the title museum.
Yes.
And it showed inside the holes.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm a hoarder.
Yeah.
Can I call it a museum?
Yeah. You could try that. Yeah. Yeah. The question is, some of these homes are jammed with things. What's the difference between hoarding and a museum? I think is the question. And it's a really good question. And a lot of people, would call these artists before the Kohler came along. They would say, Eugene Von Bruenchenhein was thought to be kind of a weirdo by some of his family. And the line between, what is an artful life and what is an unhealthy life, could be a fine line. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. But I do think that for me, it invites a way to think about what's my relationship to the space in which I live and the objects I have around me. Is it intentional? And I think there's something about that intentionality that is what makes it art. So,
Is some board to have to pass muster?
Is there a board with which it has to pass muster? I think the artistic decisions at the Kohler are uniquely driven by its curators and directors. So it's really the art people that are making those decisions.
Oh, that place in the museum. Have to go to somebody to get their approval?
If you're, say that again one more time. I didn't quite catch that. Do you need to call the Kohler to have your home named a museum? Is that what you're asking? I can give you their phone number after the talk. Okay, I think that's probably all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much.